And I welcome our last speaker, and it's certainly possibly one of the most interesting ones, so please do bear with us and stay. Colin Tudge, a science writer and broadcaster with an expertise in what he calls eco-eating and real farming. Colin, your game changer in a way is the most intuitive, in some ways the most straightforward, because it's about changing behavior. It doesn't require sort of crazy technology. But in some ways the hardest, because in some ways it goes to the heart perhaps of the very philosophy we live by. And so my question really is, to kick you off, is this compatible with our economic dogma today and with the idea of economic growth as we know it?
It's not compatible with the economic dogma of today. I think it's perfectly compatible with, as it were, human psychology. The dogma of the day is very much out of sync with what human beings are really like and what we really want. So in that sense, it ought to be easy. And it ought to be technically easy too. And the generalizations are, we can't really disagree with, that however efficiently we produce energy and however ingeniously we dispose of surplus carbon and all the rest, the ideal must be to use as little energy as possible while maintaining the sort of convivial and peaceful and just kind of existence that we want. And the second thing that seems to me to be intuitively obvious, we'd all agree with, is that the thing we absolutely have to get right is food production, in other words, agriculture. And in fact, agriculture impinges on absolutely everything that we do. And if we get agriculture right, then everything else that we aspire to, including world peace and justice and so on, that all becomes possible. But if you get the agriculture wrong, then everything else you want to do is compromised. So it's the thing you absolutely have to get right. And getting it right, I think, and this is a moral point as much as anything, getting it right means that you have to feed everybody that there is on the earth and everybody that is ever going to be on the earth. So now we have to feed 7 billion people, and by 2050 we're going to have to feed 9.5 billion people. The good news is that the United Nations demographers tell us that the rate of increase is actually going down, I mean the percentage rate of increase is going down, and that by 2050 the percentage rate of increase will be 0 on present projections, which means that the population should more or less stabilize at 9.5 billion, shouldn't get any bigger than that, and in fact will start to go down within a few decades, possibly, or certainly within a few centuries. So now, for the first time in 10,000 years, since agriculture was first practiced on a big scale, we can see that the problem of feeding the human race is actually finite. It's not going to go shooting up like this, as Malthus said, forever until it crashes. It's actually going to do that, and we can see what the size of the task is. So the question is, can we feed 7 billion people now and 9.5 by 2050? And according to the government and the government reports that they produce, this is going to be very difficult. And one of the latest government reports says we're going to have to produce 50% more food by 2050 in order to pull through and all that kind of stuff. And to do that, we're going to need biotech and GM and all that kind of stuff. And I say this is actually complete nonsense. It should be perfectly easy to feed 7 billion people. And in fact, Hans Herren of something called the IAASTD, and I can never remember what it stands for, but the T stands for technology. And he is one of the serious authorities in the world. And he points out that in principle, we already actually produce enough food, calories and protein, to feed 14 billion people. So there shouldn't be a problem. And we're already, in fact, producing more than we will need ever to feed the population at its biggest. In other words, there really shouldn't be a problem. And I wrote a book a little while ago called Feeding People is Easy, and I've now updated it, and I'll plug it because there are a few around. And this one is called Good Food for Everyone Forever, and it simply says that it is actually quite easy to produce good food for everyone forever, and we shouldn't be making a fuss about it, and we should be able to do it with much, much less fuel and energy than we are now using. And this is why it's relevant, particularly relevant to tonight's discussion. Now the question then is, how do you produce enough food for 7 billion and for 9.5 billion? And the answer is blindingly simple. The answer is that you design agriculture as if this is what you were trying to do. And create agriculture that is specifically, expressly designed to provide everybody with good food without wrecking the rest of the world. That's the requirement, and it's actually quite easy. And I call that kind of agriculture enlightened agriculture, and because enlightened agriculture has got too many syllables, we started calling it real farming, and we now have something called the Campaign for Real Farming. Now, how what are the principles here? Well, the first thing is that agriculture that feeds everybody, of course, has to be productive. But we've already covered that. We know it can be productive enough. That's not a problem. The second thing, it has to be sustainable. And sustainable doesn't mean that you have to be able to go on doing exactly the same thing forever. It means, though, that you have to be able to farm forever. In other words, you might choose to change crops at some point, but you have to maintain the fertility, which, of course, traditional farmers have been saying for the last 10,000 years. That's the job. And the third thing you have to do, and we've heard about in this age of climate change in particular, is to be resilient. You have to have agriculture that can change direction when the conditions change. And the question is then, how do you do that? And the answer very simply is that you emulate nature, which has been productive and sustainable and resilient for the last 3.5 billion years, more or less without interruption, despite the mass extinctions. They did recover after all. And how does nature do bit of a hiccup here and there. How does nature do it? The answer is, first of all, that it is very, very diverse. Don't need to expand on that. It is very tightly integrated, and it is minimum input. As little as possible goes in. Most ecosystems use what's there. They also borrow from all over the place, but they mostly use what's actually there. How does that translate into agriculture? Diversity means polyculture, lots of different crops grown side by side, genetically diverse crops, genetically diverse livestock. Secondly, integration means integration. Everything should be feeding on everything else. And third, low input actually means organic. And that doesn't really mean that you have to follow all the rules of the Soil Association, but it does mean that organic has to be your default position. And if anybody says, can organic farming really feed the world? The answer is yes, it can. The calculations have been done, the demonstrations are out there. It's not actually that difficult. If you have farms which are diverse and integrated and quasi-organic, they are bound to be very, very complex. If they're very, very complex, they're going to be labor-intensive, not just labor, not coolies, but skills-intensive, and therefore there's no advantage in scale-up. And therefore, actually, your default farm, your average farm, if there is such a thing, should be small to medium-sized. And that's what the future lies, with small to medium-sized, mixed, integrated, quasi-organic, skills-intensive farms. In other words, with the kind of farms that in structure, not necessarily in technology, but in structure, are what one would call traditional, and are the kind of farms that we had in Britain, for example, until about the 1960s. And I'm not talking about a simple reversion to the past. I mean, we have to have appropriate technologies that goes with it and all those kind of things. First of all, these kind of farms demonstrably can feed everybody, as it were, quite easily. But secondly, they also provide us with the best possible food. Because if you do the detailed structure of what you actually put into the farms, you find you need a great many plants because you should focus on arable and horticulture. You have some livestock, which you integrate into the farm in various ways, and you stick your sheep up on the hill and all that kind of stuff. So you certainly have some livestock. And you have huge variety. So you finish up producing a lot of plants, not much meat, and maximum variety. And a lot of plants, not much meat, and maximum variety summarizes in 9 words all the nutritional theory of the last 40 years. I mean, that's it. It's libraries full of it, but you can summarize it in those 9 words. And it also summarizes the basis of all the world's great cuisines. They're all done like this. They're all very rich in plants, the great cuisines, I mean. Meat is used as a garnish or as a stock or an occasional feast, but never used to excess, and hugely various. And the Turks are wonderful, the way they make wonderful feasts out of walnuts and wheat and mint and a few other things. And if a goat dies, bit in there, and so on and so on. That's what great cooking is actually about. To do this in Britain, we need about 1 million new farmers because we've got 1% of people on the land, 500,000 people. We need at least three times that many, and I think we need probably 5 times that many. And that is roughly equivalent, of course, to the number of unemployed young people, and about a third. So it actually would work rather well. To me, it is absolutely abundantly obvious that this is what we need to do. We need to go down this, what we are calling an agrarian route. We need to rebalance the economy. And the question is, why don't we do it? And the answer is, because British agriculture, or world agriculture now, like everything else, is plugged into the dogma of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism says
We're all in a global market, we all have to compete, and we all have to produce as much money as possible in the shortest possible time. This is the priority, produce a lot of money in the shortest possible time, not to produce good food. If you want to produce a lot of money in the shortest possible time, you must maximize production. That's rule number one, pile them high. And one can say that the kind of agriculture I'm talking about, in traditional agriculture, you're content to produce enough. You're content to produce what people actually need. If you've got the philosophy of trying to make as much money as possible, there's no such thing as enough. You want to remove the ceilings to production. If you've got too much food, you turn it into biofuel. You remove the ceiling, agriculture expands to fill the space available.
2 minutes.
If you have, the second thing you have to do if you want to make money is to add value. Take something cheap and turn it into something dear. So you take strawberries from Israel and you flog them at Christmas in Sainsbury's and so on and so on and so on. All that kind of stuff. And you turn cheap wheat and cheap maize, which you can make perfectly good food out of, you feed it to livestock. Or you knock down the Amazon and you grow soya and you feed that to pigs. And that's, among other things, is adding value. The third thing you have to do is to cut costs, and that is the most dangerous of all. First of all the epidemics that livestock has suffered in this country over the last 30 years, BSE, foot and mouth, swine flu, swine fever, bird flu, I'm sure there's a few others I must have missed, but one after the other, and sometimes several together, all caused by cut price husbandry, all of them, all caused by cutting costs, primarily. Secondly, if you're going to go down the route of cutting costs, you have above all to get rid of labour. If you get rid of labour, you cannot think about complexity, you cannot think about variety, you have to do the thing on the biggest possible scale with the biggest possible machines, you have to let chemistry take care of the weeds and the fertility and all that kind of stuff. In other words, the farming becomes an exercise in industrial chemistry al fresco. 1 minute, thank you. And all this biotech is basically bells and whistles. There's an irony in here, in that if you say this kind of thing to, as it were, the powers that be, government and so on, they will say you're a greenie, which is, of course, a shocking thing to do, or you're a red, you're a commie, because you're all that kind of stuff. And they say you're just an ideologue, get out of here. Actually, no, what I'm talking about is pure realism, what you actually need to do in biological terms in order to provide enough food. That is sheer realism. It's the ideologues are those who are plugged into the neoliberal economy, as it were, come what may. Now, I reckon, my last point, government is not going to do anything about this because the neoliberal economy rules in their economic growth, all that kind of stuff. That's all you ever hear about. So various friends and myself and lots of farmers and my wife, actually, we set up something a few years ago called the Campaign for Real Farming, which has a website called www.campaignforrealfarming.org. And the idea is that we try and bring about a people's takeover of the world's food supply. Nothing less will do. And the point is not to have a fight, not to have a revolution, and not either to try sort of by weak reform to sort of persuade the government to change their ways or Tesco to change their ways, because they're not going to do it. But the point is to effect what we are calling an agrarian renaissance, for people just to start doing things differently. And to this end, this is why I'm a good capitalist, really, we're advocating ethical investment, and there's a new company setting up to do this. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, that was a lot of good food for thought. And in the spirit, who can argue with good food for everyone forever? Any questions? The lady in the pink shirt. Let's cluster maybe with the gentleman behind, so the microphone can efficiently stay over there for a second.
Hi there, my name's Sarah Gordon. I'm daughter of a struggling Scottish farmer. And given that we're talking about energy here, and great if we go down the route that you've just described, obviously we're reducing the amount of energy that needs to be going into the farming. However, people don't live where you've got prime, fertile land, etc. And I can talk from experience coming from Scotland. So what do we do about distribution? Do we need to put more energy into our distribution, or do we just persuade the world's population to move to those areas where you can actually grow food?
Can we just have the second question?
This is two connected questions, which is how much will this cost, and how will you persuade 1 million people that they want to be farmers?
Right. The first point is that, funnily enough, if you analyse the total transport costs of agriculture, transport isn't actually a huge part of it. I believe it's something like 5% of the whole, despite bringing cut flowers from Kenya to sell in the high street. So, and bringing food, therefore, from say, the hills of Scotland, sheep, down to Oxfordshire is not such a big deal, in fact. One needn't worry too much about that. I would, though, think much more in terms of national self-reliance than we currently do. In other words, it's actually, you can demonstrate quite easily that virtually every country in the world, with the exception of people like Singapore and so on, could be self-reliant in food. In other words, they could produce enough for their own populations. And in a country like ours, we would be importing bananas and coffee and tea and stuff like that, provided we pay for it properly, you know, fair trade and all that stuff. But if you then you base your cuisine on what you grow locally, which traditionally we did, and it was very, very good, and even the Scots used to have a very good cuisine in the olden days, you can live pretty well without, you know, it shouldn't be a problem. That's not the problem. It's the amount of fertility that goes in, it's the amount of cultivations that go in, and the packaging and all that. It's all that kind of stuff that really does it. What was the other question? Cost.
How much does it cost? And
oh, the 1 million people persuading bit. You don't need to. I mean, I give loads of talks, not necessarily to an audience like this, but loads, and there simply is no doubt that lots and lots of people, nobody's done a survey to find out how many, but would really like to go back to the land. If we're talking about 1 million new farmers, we're talking about a 30th of the British workforce. That's not very much. And there are just loads of people out there who would really love to get back. It's not a question of persuading, it's a question of making it possible. What you need is something like a career ladder. We don't have that at the moment, so there are various things like community-supported agriculture and various local groups whereby the community employs people to become farmers and that kind of thing, various ad hoc arrangements, but between them they can add up to something. Transitional costs are always look expensive. I mean, one reason why supermarket food can look cheap, although it isn't actually, if you analyse it, it's not really cheap at all, but it looks it because it's very deceptively priced. But the main reason it looks cheap is because the whole economy is now geared to that kind of arrangement. And it isn't geared to local production and local sales and so on and so on.
It's again the carbon price, right? That isn't in there, in a way.
Yeah. If it were, if the economy, you know, it's a question of momentum. If the economy were geared to the small farm and the local economy, then you'd find it would actually be cheaper than what we've now got, because you're saving so much in costs.
Right, we've got a last question. This is a lot of pressure on you, right here. Can I have in fact, I'm sorry. Maybe you can talk to Mr. Tudge afterwards. Sorry.
I've got a microphone. Hello, Rob Bailey from Chatham House. I'm slightly less confident than you are that the evidence shows that organic farming can feed 9 billion people. Certainly, from what I've seen, there are some remarkable case studies showing very significant yield and productivity increases, but these are often very hard to replicate. And you can make similar arguments against GM. Some field trials for GM show very remarkable increases in productivity, but it can be very difficult to replicate. And the point here is that agriculture technologies are highly context-specific. What works in one place doesn't necessarily work in another. It depends on land tenure, market institutions, access to finance, access to knowledge, the particular position that the farmer's in. So how confident are you really that this top-down, almost one-size-fits-all approach that you're advocating can meet these challenges? And I'm thinking particularly now about some of the most food insecure countries in the world where population growth is very rapid and soil depletion is extremely desperate.
Well, I think my solution is far less top-down and far less one-size-fits-all than the one we have at the moment, which is very much controlled from the top and is very much the big industrial model. My point about organic farming, I am pretty convinced that if it's done well, and it's very hard to do it well, that in most contexts it would work. I mean, there are lots of examples of it working well. There are lots of figures that show, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Also can work very, very well over time, which you know, you take a 10-year average with your mixed crops, this is all part of it. And you find that even though in the peak years it's not as good as the industrial way of doing it, over the time it is, because you know you lose on some and you gain on others, that kind of thing. The other thing is I said, you know, that initially one should regard organic as the default position. It's the thing you aim for. But you don't, if you find for whatever reason it's not working, I mean, I would say, well, you know, bung in some nitrogen if you really feel you've got to do it. But, so you can overcome all that kind of problem. What was the other point you made? Sorry, what was it?
Sub-Saharan Africa and soil depletion.
Oh, well, Sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, we are in good contact with quite a lot of African farmers. I wish we were in contact with more, but it's a question of having, you know, enough people to keep in touch. There simply is no doubt. I mean, the alternative for them is to get stuff from the, you know, rich countries and all that kind of stuff. There's no doubt that most African countries could easily be self-reliant in food, which would be a much better position than trying to make lots of money and then importing basic stuff that they could be growing. And there's no doubt from anybody that I've ever talked to who knows about African farming that the route to go down is organic. Certainly adapted to the conditions, of course, always, but that has to be the route.
Right, I think we're going to have to leave it there, but I promised you a vote, so very quickly. I know these 5 game changers aren't necessarily competing with one another, and in the future perhaps we'll see an energy mix including all of these technologies, but you as voters and taxpayers, can I have a very informal show of hands for each of the 5 game changers that you would be most likely to want your tax pounds to be spent on? Let's start with initiative number 1, which was CCS, I believe. Show of hands. CCS? Okay. Right. Generation 4 nuclear energy. Can I have an alternative vote to that? How many of the ones who didn't vote for this would have voted for it before Fukushima? Anyone? Okay. Solar energy. Right. Driverless rail cabs. A few people. And eco-eating and real farming. Well, it looks to me that solar won the floor tonight. It certainly is the biggest source of energy. Well, that was a fascinating debate, very varied, and I don't claim to be able to summarize it. I might try anyways, because I'm a journalist, and you know what we do. We simplify first, and then we exaggerate. So perhaps in one sentence, the one thing I feel I learned tonight is that the frontier or the limitation is no longer technology, which is what it used to be with politicians pushing ahead. Today, I believe it's the other way around. It seems to me, from what we heard, technology is actually becoming more viable, and what we need is politicians to actually drive up the political will and ultimately really go for the final and ultimate game changer in energy, and that is a carbon price. Thank you very much.